Now, you have a process here in making beer itself, and I see it's quite in-depth. Could you take us through the process itself, though, Bob?
Yeah, I can do that simply. The beer is really a simple beverage to make, and it's made with the same raw materials no matter where you go in the world. Beer always has to include primarily water, malt, hops, and yeast. In North America, it's common to use a fifth ingredient, another grain, which provides starch, and it lessens the impact of the barley, which is really flavorful. In our case, we use cornmeal. One could also use rice or sorghum or wheat or anything that provides starch, which eventually will be converted into sugar, which then ferments into alcohol, which a lot of people find an important commodity in beer. So we start off with the barley malt, which is the main ingredient. It's barley which has been processed at a malting plant, in our case at Canada Malting in Thunder Bay. We crush it in a mill and weigh it out in a scale and then add it to its cooker. At the same time, the cornmeal is weighed out and added to its cooker, and the two cereal grains are cooked separately according to a specific temperature cycle. Once you have the two grains together, you have to separate the liquid from the solid, because the solid is the mash, and it's not useful after you extract all of the sugars from it. So in the process of cooking, all of the starches in those cereals are converted to sugar. We don't add sugar. Those sugars come from the starch that's in the cereal naturally. In the lauter tun here, it's like a big coffee percolator, basically. What it does is separate the liquid and the solid. So all of the grain that has been cooked settles out on the bottom, and then we keep adding hot water to the top until all of the extract from the grain is washed out, just like washing water over coffee grains. And all of that liquid extract, which is called wort, collects in a brew kettle. That's what will become the beer. What's left behind is grain, spent grain we call it, that has still a lot of food value to it. And what happens to that, Mr. Brayson from Echo Bay comes by and picks it up and feeds that to his cattle. I guess they get a hot meal once in a while.
Oh, good idea. It's recyclable.
It's all recyclable, yeah, exactly. There's very little in the brewing process, actually, which isn't recyclable. The boiling wort is then, the hops are added to the boiling wort, and hops are kind of the spices of brewing. From using a variety of different hops, a brewer can make a variety of different beers, and that's usually what differentiates one beer from another, is they have different hops. The hops are what give the beer its bitter taste. Without hops, beer would taste like barley soup. So when you smell beer, that's what you're really smelling, is the hops. The hops work like tea leaves, though. They have to be added to a boiling liquid. So that's why we boil the wort, so that when we add the hops, just like making tea, the longer you leave those hops, the more they work and the more bitter the beer becomes. So you can control how bitter your beer is by that. After the wort is boiled for a couple hours, it will be pumped upstairs into a hot wort tank, and then finally into the fermenter where the yeast is added. The yeast is now added to this wort solution, which is about 11% sugar, and when all of that is fermented away, there's no sugar left, but there's 5% alcohol. That takes about 10 days to ferment from that 11% sugar down to zero, so that happens in these fermentation tanks. After 10 days, the beer is dropped downstairs to a cold storage area where it's aged for a week or so, and all of the protein that we don't want in the beer settles out. It's cooled, it's filtered, and it's put into a secondary aging tank for another 3 to 4 weeks, aging again, and the flavor improves and mellows as time goes on in that aging process. The day before we're going to package it, we'll cool it again, filter it a second time, this time through a finer filter than the first one, so it's sparkling clear, and it'll end up in the finished beer tank where it sits no more than a day before it's packaged. So the whole process from the brewing to the packaging will take probably 5 weeks at a minimum. In the packaging, which is what we're doing today, the beer will transfer underground through a stainless steel line up into the beer filler. The bottles, of course, are washed first, rinsed, electronically and visually inspected. They're filled, they're capped, they're pasteurized, which allows you to keep the beer at room temperature. Draft beer is never pasteurized, so it has to be kept cold all the time. The shelf life of draft beer is perhaps 6 weeks at the outside for beer that's been kept cold all the time. That would never do for bottled beer, which has to be kept at room temperature. So the pasteurization allows you to keep that beer at room temperature for perhaps 4 months. The bottles are inspected again for the correct fill, and they are labeled and packed into cases, and out they go. the difference in the draft is that it's the same. You start with exactly the same beer, superior in our case, as what is bottled, but instead of going through the heat of the pasteurizer, it goes directly into the keg filler that will fill the previously washed and sterilized kegs. That beer never is allowed to reach room temperature.
How many different types, Bob, how many different types of beer does Northern Breweries actually brew?
We'll actually make 6 brands of lager here in our Sault Ste. Marie plant. Our sister plant in Sudbury makes Northern Ale, which is one of our major brands. So they make the ale there, we make the lager here.
How do you achieve those different types of beer?
Well, the main way you do that, except in the case of red maple, which is a sort of a special case, the main way you do that is through the hops. As I mentioned earlier, by varying the type of hop you use, the bitterness that comes from the hops can be changed. The flavor that comes from the hops is variable. And so by starting with a basic recipe, but a handful of different kinds of hops, you can end up with some very different tasting beer. Now, in the case of red maple, that's a different story, because with red maple, I use a black roasted malt as opposed to a pale malt, which gives it that nice dark color. Yeah. And of course, there's just a little hint of St. Joe's maple syrup in there as well. That's added right at the end, right before we bottle it. So it's not fermented away, but it's not enough that it's sweet. You know, people don't want sweet beer, I guess. So that's different. There's lots of different ways to make beer, but varying the hops is the main way.
Mm-hmm. Bob, now I understand you're going to take us down and see the bottling process, at least that. But you know, I've made an observation, and I've got to pass this on, and I hope Dave gets a shot of you, because to me, I visualize a brewmaster with having somewhat of a large abdomen.
A large sampling muscle. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
But to me, look at the fit and trim. I mean, you look good.
It's, I know a lot of people, when I give tours, expect to find a 65-year-old German brewmeister, you know, that's maybe had a couple of beer in his day. That was my boss. He retired recently. I don't know. I have a hyperactive metabolism or something. I've been here around 20 years, and I still sort of hear that brewmaster, you know, how does that happen? But it's mostly by experience.
Now, Bob, what part of the process are we in now?
We're in the top floor of the bottle shop, and in the carton forming area. The cartons that we get from our various suppliers come in flat, and we have to form them up into a box shape and glue the bottom, and that's what this machine behind us is doing. Forming them up with hot melt glue on the bottom, and that by the time they come out, the bottoms are sealed, and we send those cases downstairs where they'll be filled.
How many cases do you do in an average, let's say, a ship like this, Bob?
Well, it's split up between 6s and 12s and 24s across different brands. If we were doing one brand and one package size all day, it might be in the range of 3,000 24s in a day.
Wow!
That's a lot of beer. Here we are at the beginning and the ending of the bottling process. The empties that we use are the same empties used by over 90% of the bottles in Ontario are this bottle that we use. So the empties come from all the other brewers as well as our own empties. The fellas behind or in front of us here are putting the bottles on the bottle washer. The bottle washer will clean and sterilize the bottle as well as remove the label from it. The bottle shop follows a U shape, and the full goods come out right beside the empties on the other side. So that's how I say we're at the beginning and the end. We can walk up and have a look at the middle.
Bob, just on a shift such as this, how many bottles would you go through? Let's say through the washer being filled and this and that into the cases.
A good shift will probably be around 70,000 bottles that we'll put on here in a good day.
Well, that's a lot of thirsty customers.
Yeah, we hope so.
And continuing on, Bob, with the bottling process,
All right, the empty bottles that we put into the soaker at the other end come out at this end, and what this fellow is looking for, he's looking for bottles which are not the standard bottles. Sometimes foreign bottles sneak in there. He's also looking for bottles with any obvious defects in them, chips in the neck, or any foreign matter inside. Anything that might escape his attention is caught by the empty bottle inspector off to one side, which inspects each bottle individually and rejects any that it deems to be unclean or chipped in any way defective. The clean and sterile bottles then follow down the line and go into the filler. The beer that's coming into the filler comes from the cellars, the cold storage cellars, through an underground line and comes up inside the filler bowl. The bottles are filled under pressure, and then we want them to foam over like this at the end, so that all the air that's in the neck of the bottle is pushed out. You know, air is real bad for the flavor of beer, so we push all the air out of the neck with all this foam, and then we apply the crown or the cap on top of the bottle. From here, the bottles go into the pasteurizer along the back wall here, and that will sterilize the beer that's in the bottle and allow you to store it at room temperature instead of having to keep it cold like draft beer, which isn't pasteurized. Go ahead.
Bob, the fellow that's looking actually into the bottles after they've been filled, what is he looking for again?
We call him the foam picker.
Oh, the foam picker.
Yeah, the foam picker sits at the end of the pasteurizer and watches the bottles as they come out of the pasteurizer. And what he's looking for is a particular kind of foam that is on the top of a bottle which might not be intact or clean. If it's chipped, or if there's a crack in it, or if there's any foreign object in it, the bottle has a different kind of foam on it. So he's picking them bottles off as the foam picker that he is. Doing a fine job too. He's also looking for that the bottles are filled to the right height. From there, the bottles will carry along on the line. They're counted electronically, and then they pass through the labeler where the correct label is applied, one per bottle. And the bottles will then carry along into the packer. And when the packer is full of bottles and there's a case underneath, the sensors will allow the bottles to drop into the case. From there, the cases go down the line where the tops are glued, and they're piled and shipped. So here we are in the cold storage cellars. The beer that we're bottling right now that we just saw is coming from this room. This is the room where the beer, after it's brewed and fermented, is dropped down into this room where it's aged. It's like the big aging cellar. And all of these tanks are filled with various brands of beer. The beer will sit in these tanks for 4 to 5 weeks, aging, settling. We'll filter the beer a couple of times before we package it. The beer that we're bottling today was filtered yesterday, so there's no delay between the time it's filtered and the time it's packaged, so it's in maximum condition, you know, it's in the peak condition. We carbonate the beer here, filter it, cool it, and age it. And basically, the rest of what happens here happens on its own. The beer has to sit like wine and mature, and the flavor improves as it sits.
Well, Bob, we thank you so much for the tour. A couple of things, though, that I've learned along the way. That making beer, there is a lot more to it than actually meets the eye.
Indeed, there is. A lot of people say that when they come through here. They're amazed that there's this much equipment packed into such a small space, and that there's this much to the whole process.
The only thing I couldn't get out of you so far was some of the recipes.
Well, I could tell you, but you know what they say.
Yeah. Thanks again, Bob. This has been absolutely great.
It's been fun for me. Thank you, Dan.
OMA is a proud sponsor of JobWorks. OMA's mission is to effectively represent and respond to the social, cultural, and political interests of the Métis and other off-reserve Aboriginal people of Ontario.